So welcome to Central St Martin's for the final event in the Future Imagineries series this week. My name is Lucy Kimball and I'm Director of the Innovation Insights Hub, which is a cross-university resource, and I'm Professor of Contemporary Design Practices here. The aim of this whole series has been trying to bring cross-disciplinary approaches to understand some of the sites and the places and the situations where different kinds of design and imagining of the futures is happening. And tonight we're talking about policies and the making of policy and the intersections with design and imagining. Just to let you know, we are audio recording this, hence the microphone. This is so that the many people who wanted to be here can listen to the audio cast later. So that will be available on the UAL, University of the Arts website in a few weeks' time. And we may also be taking a few photos, which may also end up on a UAL website or in a talk in the future. If you have any problems with that, please let me know. So I'm not going to say much because I know Noah has a lot to say. We had a rather amazing workshop this morning with our collaborators at Policy Institute King's and about 24 other people doing a sort of practical workshop. But I did want to say something about why is a design school talking about policy? What do we have to say at all about the world of policy making? So let's take product design, which is at one end, one kind of design work that happens in this building, and you can see lots of bits of it outside, not to do with Central St Martin's though. A future product, somebody designing a future product is designing something that goes into an ecosystem, and that ecosystem is shaped by rules and regulations and government policy agendas, and if there is an industry policy, it might be favouring biosciences and pharma, or it might be favouring data analysis and so on. And so the development of products and the design of products is already implicated with policy, and any designer has to negotiate not just the materials and the uses that things are put to, but actually think about the social, cultural and economic context that those uses exist within, and also potentially the workers' rights, for example, or lack of them if you're Uber. So designing products is already involved with policy imaginaries, or perhaps more indirectly than we're going to be talking about tonight. Tonight we're perhaps looking more about when design is directly, the practices and methods associated with design are more directly connected with imagining future societies, near future societies, not necessarily demonstrating what they will be, but exploring what they might be. So it's more methodological, it's an approach, it's trying things out and exploring rather than definitely proposing what should be. And there's a whole range of ways that design methods are being applied or appropriated or indeed misappropriated inside governments. Some of the people we had this morning were from the Policy Lab team in the UK government here. Some of you may know there's an EU Policy Lab now. In fact, there's about 300 people meeting quite soon, actually 200 who are from policy labs all over the world in a couple of weeks in Brussels. So there's lots of ways that design is already intersecting directly as a kind of creative, generative practice with the making of policy, not just public services, but making policy and to deal with citizenship. And Noah's going to talk about Dubai, the particular context he works in, and obviously it's a different context to the one we work in here in the UK, so that's a big we. You might not all be working in the UK. But I just wanted to draw attention to something that I was reading yesterday, which seemed relevant. So in the current issue of the London Review of Books, there's a review by Kristin Surak of a book called The Cosmopolites, or possibly Polites, can't quite tell, The Coming of the Global Citizen by Atossa Aracha Abrahamian. And basically this book looks at the ability of citizens, people who want to become citizens of a country, to basically buy their way into being a citizen of that country. And I did not know, but the London Review of Books reviewer told me that for £2 million, and £2 million investment in UK government bonds or shares in a UK company, you can purchase a Tier 1 visa to be in the UK, right? So I kind of knew that. If you have an extra 3 million, you can it's basically fast track citizenship and then a UK passport. Okay, so that's a lot of money. 5 million. except it turns out it's not 5 million, because once you've got your passport or your permanent residency, you can basically sell those government bonds and sell those shares and get your 5 million back, assuming it hasn't gone down a great deal. So basically the cost actually is about 10 grand. So it's 10 grand to get permanent residence, assuming you have the 5 million in the first place. So this is a context, because NOAA is working in an environment which is not a democracy. We are, although the democracy, the fruits of that democracy, we are all living with at the moment. So where does design play into that? Well, we're going to see some particular examples of imagining, futuring, and so on. So I'm just going to introduce NOAA, and then Carl Miller, who is going to be doing a response to NOAA's talk, and then there'll be an open Q&A. I'll start with NOAA. So NOAA Rafford is the Chief Operating Officer of the Dubai Futures Foundation, and working as an advisor in the UAE Prime Minister's office. And you're going to talk a little bit more about that, a little bit. So a little bit on his background. He was previously at the strategy consultancy Monitor, done lots of scenarios and futures work, and if you're following Noah on Twitter, very amusing and sort of offering sort of all sorts of insights from these worlds that he's sort of crossing. Noah's PhD was from MIT. He's also studied at the Bartlett and involved in a whole range of fields. And I think brings quite a lot of cross-disciplinary, so sort of analytical and creative and sort of leadership perspectives to these questions that we're addressing today. Carl Miller, who is doing the response, is the founding research director of the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos. And I just asked, and it is a full-time job, which is half policy and half research hub. So actually a think tank that does things, and a think tank that does things with technology, and particularly interested in sort of addressing the vacuum among our political elites, I think, about understanding and doing things with digital media, the digital, and so on. And he's a frequent contributor to various more mainstream media outlets, and also an associate of King's College London, with whom UAL has a new partnership. We have a new joint PhD programme, crossing design and policy. So I will stop there and hand over to Noah, and then we'll hear from Carl. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. It's one of those rare and beautiful days of sunshine outside where you normally tear off your overcoat and hurl yourself into the nearest green space. So I'm very appreciative that you're here on such a beautiful London day. I'm going to try and cover a fair bit of ground about the background of Dubai and the UAE, and the some of the work that we've been doing there, and how this I think is representative of a new way of approaching the design and policy and foresight, particularly in times of systemic transformation which we're experiencing now, and then suggest some lessons that this might have for us, or some indications that this might point to us to consider moving forward. So as Lucy mentioned, I live and work in Dubai. I've been in Dubai for the last 7 years now. It's my 7th year. I was in London for about 8 years before that. I see some of my old friends here. And we joined the Prime Minister's office in the UAE first and foremost, where we started the country's first national foresight unit. This is a very traditional exercise looking at using scenario planning and trend assessment to try to explore how things are changing and what does that mean from a threat perspective or an opportunity perspective at the national level. But what we found very quickly was that the traditional process of policy reporting was A, not as effective, and because B, it wasn't very interesting, and C, there was just tons and tons and tons of it. So we very rapidly segued into exploring the space of design fiction or speculative design, where instead of doing a bunch of research, producing a report or a PowerPoint deck and just leaving it there, you do your research, perhaps in a traditional way, perhaps with different stakeholders, and you develop a speculative product or a prototype or a piece of media which serves to both communicate some of the more intangible aspects of that issue and also suggest possible ways of interacting with or dealing with that. So that's then spun off into this thing which you're seeing here. We've done several of these exhibitions called the Museum of the Future, and this is a building which is currently under construction right by Emirates Towers, which if you ever come to Dubai, I welcome you all to Dubai. It's right in the middle of town, and it's this big, beautiful sort of silver spaceship that represents this object of the future. And it's comprised of both exhibition spaces, around 2,200 square meters of exhibition space, partnership labs, so taking the ideas and concepts which come out of this and then developing prototypes that we can test at the citywide scale with our partners in government and industry, and then events and community spaces, so workshop theaters, lectures, schools, etc. So this is just the geographic context. Who's ever been to the UAE or Dubai? Handful of you, I know. So the UAE is situated right in between what is normally considered rather difficult part of the world, the Gulf. It's right across the water from Iran. It's in between Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Yemen. India, its closest, biggest trade partner, is just to the east. And so it's this very interesting transition because almost half of the world's population lives within an 8-hour flight of Dubai. So you can get about 3.5 billion people within an 8-hour flight. And as a result, it's emerged as this nexus, this hub of a transformation in the 21st century. There are 7 different emirates in the country. An emirate is essentially like a strong city-state, and they come together into a federal union. And it's worth doing a little bit of perspective here because the country was founded in 1971. Is anybody older, born before 1971 in the room? Yeah, like half of us, right? Exactly. So at the time when the nation was founded, I mean, certainly the country is younger than this building, although this building was recently refurbished, probably younger than the streets around this by several orders of magnitude. So it's an extremely new nation state. When the country was founded, Sheikh Rashid, this guy on the left, the father of the current ruler of Dubai and prime minister, says a small country with big dreams. And this encapsulates several of the important facts about UAE political culture, that it's always been very, very aspirational and transformational. But at the time, there were no universities when the country was founded. There were no universities and only one high school. There were almost no roads. I mean, I've spoken to some old policemen whose only job was to drive the one Land Rover around the desert dunes and find the cars that had been abandoned because the cars like ran out of gas and the guys just abandoned their car because they didn't want to deal with it. And there was just one hospital. When the country was formed, there were only 45 college graduates. Now, the UAE as a whole has one of the highest literacy rates in the region. It has one of the highest gender equality ratios in the world. Over 65% of all government officials, especially senior government officials, are held by women. And it has a better life expectancy than Sweden, the UK, and the United States. So in a period of 43 years, it's undergone this extreme transformation from literally a sort of Stone Age desert with very few buildings, very few facilities, very little educational and social development to, in Dubai in particular, a thriving city which hosts over 200 different nationalities and is home to this vast swath of the fastest growing portion of the world, Asia, India, North Africa, all coming together through Dubai. That has contributed, this global crossroads sense has contributed to it being one of the wealthiest cities in the world in terms of GDP per capita, second only to Qatar. But what's a sort of little known fact is that only 2% of Dubai's GDP comes from oil. Right? Obviously, its surrounding states, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, Oman, have very natural gas and natural resource richness, but Dubai is primarily a service and a trade economy now and increasingly a sort of innovation application hub. So just for a little bit more evidence around this regard, so Dubai International Airport is the world's busiest airport, has almost 80 million people going through it per year, and they just opened a second airport, which already has something like 12 million people going per year, and we are exploring integration of a very, very high-speed train, which you may have heard of, called a Hyperloop, between one airport and the other, which would make it Terminal 1 and Terminal 2 of the same airport. So it would be like literally the world's biggest airport by orders of magnitude. And in terms of its global connectivity, I mentioned that India is the UAE's #1 trading partner, second only to the United States. So there are 450 flights a week between Dubai and India. There's something like 20 flights, something like 8 flights a day to the UK. So it's an extraordinarily well-connected place, and it's this hub that connects north, south, east, west. So 90% of the passengers going from Dubai to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, for example, are Chinese nationals, right, transiting through Dubai on their way to do business in Brazil. So it's this serious global integrator. It's not just in terms of physical trade and financial trade. Actually, this vast volume of flows and people of ideas expresses itself in terms of the service economy as well. So the Dubai Mall, which you see here, it has home to 80 million visitors a year, 80 million visitors, which is 2.5 times more people than the entire city of New York. The Dubai Mall, one building, receives 2.5 more times visitors than the entire city of New York. It just gives you some sense of scale, of the vastness of the of transactions which occur here, and the speed of activity. So, if you think about this, the velocity of transformation from no roads, one hospital, one high school, to dozens of universities, all of the volume of exchange that I just mentioned. This is a city and a people which are extremely familiar with, and indeed philic for, change. Right? It's not change averse. It's very change philic. It's change prone because they have worked through this experience of change for continually better experiences. And the leadership there has a lot to do with this. So this is Sheikh Mohammed. He is the Prime Minister of the UAE, the Vice President of the UAE, and also the ruler of Dubai. And the Arab culture has this tradition called the ruler's bargain. So when you were a small tribe, the Sheikh's job was to take care of you. Right, to give you food, to make sure you were safe, to make sure all of your needs were being met. In exchange for taking care of you, you granted him political legitimacy. Right, so not absolute decision-making power. This is a very consultative culture. You have this concept called majlis, where all the families are consulted in a formal and informal way before any decision is made. But this sense of ruler's bargain has carried through into the present day in the form of an extreme dedication to public services and public goods. So this is one of my favorite quotes from here. Our role as government is to make people's lives easier and to help them achieve happiness. Our duty is to offer all segments of society the best possible public services. So you have this combination of an extraordinarily fast-moving society, which is intimately familiar with and embracing parts of the future, and a dedication to public good and public services. And that expresses itself in various ways. So for example, every hotel you'll go to in the world has a star rating system. The Prime Minister says, why is it that you can rate a hotel? You can see if a good hotel is a bad hotel based on the number of stars it has, but you can't review and rate government offices. So we created this thing called the 7-star service system, where every government office and every government department at the front door has how good it's doing that year. 3 stars, 4 stars, 5 stars, and this really matters. Like, people strive very, very hard to increase the rating of their service because the vast majority of Emirati citizens, upwards of 95%, work in government. Right? So you have this interesting combination of government as employer, aspirations to improve civil services through government, and this sense of futurity and aspirational vision. Another example about this is in 2014, the Prime Minister says, right, why is it that I can book a flight on my mobile phone 24 hours a day, but I can't interact with my government departments 24 hours a day? So he issued a challenge called the M-Government Award, the M-Government Challenge, which said next year in 2015, we're going to stand on this stage and all federal government services will be available on a mobile phone. And the ministries which conform to this will be awarded, and the ministries which don't quite make this will be named and shamed. And lo and behold, the next year there was an award. Several of the ministries were awarded for this, and several of the other ministries were, let us say, not awarded in a very public fashion. So I want to set this context because the work that we've been doing around speculative design and speculative policy engagement comes in this background. So when we're asked, for example, what is the future of government services, this is not just an idle question, right? This is a question which is central to the legitimacy and ethos and aspirations of the government in relation to the people, right? And when I say the people, it's not just Emirati citizens, but to residents such as myself, to the 80 million people that come through there doing businesses, and in some respects to the 3.5 billion people who have some degree of engagement in Dubai vis-a-vis its role as a central integrating hub. But instead of doing a report, which is like, say, a 20th century approach to a 21st century challenge, right? We decided to approach 21st century challenges in a 21st century way. So you probably have seen this graph. This is from the World Bank. There was an economist report on the World Bank, and it just shows the number of downloads per reports produced on the World Bank website for over a 4-year period from 2008 to 2012. The takeaway of this is over 70% of the reports written by the World Bank never got read by anyone. They were never downloaded once, right? And of the remaining 30%, only 30% of those were read more than 100 times. So this is interesting. This is, I think, interesting evidence which shows that this approach to trying to understand policy change, trying to understand rapid, fast-moving environments, trying to engage people in these issues in a way that they care about is, let us say, less than effective, right? So instead of doing that, we decided to create a more designerly immersive experience using a discipline called design fiction or speculative design, and we created this immersive theme park exhibition of what the future of government services might be like. This is one of them. We've done them 3 years in a row now, and each year they've gotten bigger and more ambitious and more complex and more attractive and more interesting, and that's what built the political momentum up to the Permanent Museum of the Future, which I showed you at the beginning. And what this allows people to do is go into this thing and start to get a sense for how might self-driving vehicles impact the city? What is artificial intelligence? What is the role of artificial intelligence in my job? What is the healthcare system of the future looking like? And all of these is based on quite in-depth research, both with experts and analysts and technologists, but also with designers and users around what does this actually mean for people. So we combine these needs, education, healthcare, transport, housing, all the things around public services provision with these emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, robotics, automation, sensors, AR and VR, synthetic biology, these things which are fundamentally transforming our world. And we try to explore what does that mean, what does that feel like, what are the issues associated with that, and what might we want to do about them. So I just want to show you a few examples. This has many approaches, many benefits. The first of which is that it's very tangible, right? So this is, instead of a report, you can actually touch this thing. I always like to say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a prototype is worth 1,000 pictures, and an experience is worth 1,000 prototypes. So if you can actually show someone what the thing is and they can experience and touch it, then it has far more impact on a nonverbal level, emotionally, viscerally, physically, than something which is a report. This is an example around the future of home healthcare, and what this illustrates is basically the convergence of ubiquitous sensor technology with the kinds of diagnostic capabilities that we all have on our iPhones right now, and very simple Watson-like diagnostics in your home environment. So Watson right now diagnoses cancers with 90% accuracy, 30 times faster than a trained physician, and right now this is being offered for pennies on the dollar as a cloud service. So the idea that in the future we would be able to integrate these services into a censored environment that was our home, and it isn't going to look like some sort of mad scientist lab, but it's got to actually have consumer values associated with it. It needs to look nice, it needs to function well, it needs to be attractive, it needs to be a bathroom that you would buy, a mirror that you would want in your home, right? Is reflective of a design process, right? So we looked at these research trends, we looked at how people's needs are changing vis-a-vis home healthcare and public health, and we created this speculative example of this digital smart mirror. And as the way this works is, as you brush your teeth in the morning, it's taking sensor readings of your saliva. As you're brushing your hair, it's doing readings of your eyes and all sorts of blood pressure and basic clinical diagnostics that you can do now today with your iPhone. And right now in India, these are being rolled out at a very large scale where, for pennies, you can do fairly advanced diagnostics just by taking a high-resolution picture of someone's eye. And it's then integrated in a user journey experience. So, for example, Lucy, you've been working very hard this week, and as you scan yourself, it tells you this. 2 of your colleagues have a cold. Your chances of getting a cold are 30% higher today. Should we give you some more vitamin C this morning in your breakfast? So this is a direct experience of the way medicine is changing vis-a-vis personalization, vis-a-vis ubiquitous sensors, vis-a-vis artificial intelligence diagnostics, right? And integrated in a very enjoyable way, right? So of course, I would rather be able to get a checkup at my home while I'm brushing my teeth before I go to work, then I would have to go down to the clinic and book a time slot and take time out of work and then buy some expensive prescriptions, etc. One of the other user journeys here was around you're not getting a physical exercise, so you have a free slot in your diary at 3:30. Why don't I book a little walk around the park for you? So this is reflective of not just a technological shift, right? All of these things are technologically capable within the near future and certainly somewhat almost inevitable in the medium-term future, and their costs are getting exponentially lower every year, but also reflects a whole use case scenario around what would the business model be? How would this interact with your life? Is this something that would be desirable and interesting? And in doing so, it allows people to really easily engage with that and provokes questions which we as policymakers want to be asking. So, for example, to interact with this, we had them scan their hand on this little plate. Now, this is not a real hand scanner. It's just a piece of metal with a little blue LED beneath it that responded to you when you touched it. But it simulated in a symbolic way what interaction with a home scanning system might be like. And people started asking us, wait a second, what are you doing with my data? Who is actually scanning me here? It wasn't real. Nobody was scanning you at all, right? But it was simulating what a scanning environment would be like. And as a result, providing this sort of spine-tingling, intuitive sensation around data privacy. Data privacy is one of the most important issues of the 21st century. It will be increasingly so, particularly when it comes to sensitive stuff like medical records, like healthcare, and without us even having to ask, how do you feel about data privacy in a ubiquitously censored world, and what should we do to mitigate the risks of data breach, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? People immediately started raising those questions in dialogue with this experience. So as a tool for generating provocation, as a tool for generating emotional responses that provoke cognitive reflection, this is an extremely effective approach, far more so, I would argue, than any report or PowerPoint that you're ever going to get from McKinsey or an analyst. The approach is also extremely engaging. So this is an example, a public health example. It's just illustrating possible combination of games. Children love games with sensors and physical activity monitors in a very fun environment. So obesity is a very large problem for children, not just in the developing world, but also in the developed world. We had some people here in the workshop from King's this morning who were forecasting that up to 70% of the UK's population is likely to be obese by 2035, right? So I mean, this is an extraordinarily large multifactorial issue. And it's a particular experience, which is basically like a virtual reality bowling alley, / gym. We tried to focus on that for children. So kids hate going to the doctor. Kids aren't getting enough food, exercise, and yet kids love to play games. So how could we create an experience which would suggest how these might be integrated in such a way that would solve the public health needs for large-scale population evaluation, for the personal needs, for recording information about how you are, and also for getting more activity. So you pick up this metal ball here. It's pretty heavy. It's packed with sensors, and you play this game where you swing the ball around to pop these little circles on the screen in this kind of interactive, fun journey. Now, this is interesting because, one, it actually gets your heart moving. I mean, you feel what it would be like to engage. You're actively exercising. In the context of these exhibitions, these are ministers and permanent secretaries and heads of states and CEOs and influential authors playing this game, right? So you engage them instead of, Your Excellency, have you read the latest policy briefing around physical activity and the role of technology in physical activity, right? Great, that's not very exciting. I mean, those of you who work in politics realize that actually most politicians' lives is extremely dull and terrifying. So to have to read another policy brief is like the last thing that is of interest to them. But to actually be able to do something fun and beautiful and interesting here is I mean, politicians are human beings as well, right? Civil servants are human beings as well. This is a way of engaging them in a complex political, social, technological topic that is actually fun and packed with insight, right? So, for example, how this exercise preceded some real-world developments by a factor of by 6 or 7 months. In this case, this is a picture that a colleague sent me from New York. There's a gym in New York which uses a ball and this gamified playing environment where you have to throw this heavy ball at the numbers that light up, and you run around and you're getting your physical activity through a gamified way. It's not linked then to any sense of real-time sensation or real-time monitoring, and therefore to public health, but you get a scorecard, and the more calories you burn, the better points you have, and so it's this gamified environment as a response to public health. And then just shortly thereafter, Pokemon Go hit the streets. So this was July of this summer. Pokemon Go was this extraordinary success, downloaded over 500 million times. It added $10 billion to Nintendo's books within a period of 2 weeks. And the way Pokemon Go works, has anyone played Pokemon Go? Avidly. All right, there's at least, okay, good, great. I was going to say you can't call yourself someone interested in the future if you haven't actually at least downloaded Pokemon Go once, but there are some of us in there. So Pokemon Go is a game which is on your phone, and it's based on where you are. It's geolocative. So imagine you're standing on here. I turn on Pokemon Go. It shows me a map of the environment using Google Maps, and on that map are little Pokies, pocket monsters, right? Pokemons. And the game is to go to the place where the Pokemon is and basically take a picture of it. And by taking a picture of it, you capture it. And there's different species and different kinds of monsters, and different kinds of monsters are worth more than others. But the key point here is you have to walk to this place to get it, to capture the Pokemon. And it's fun, and it's social. And since the 2 months that this thing has launched, people playing the game have walked over 2.8 billion miles, which is the distance from the sun to Neptune. If you do the math on that, that means that this game alone translates to a loss of over 97 million pounds. Right? I don't mean financial pounds, I mean like pounds off our thighs. That's 340 billion calories burned playing this game. So this game, which is an augmented reality social experience, just like the one that we were simulating here, is the single most effective obesity intervention ever in the history of all policy, ever, right? And it had nothing to do with government. So had we not shown this game to the ministers, and when he calls me up and says, okay, what is Pokemon Go, right? I said, you remember that game that we played last year? Yeah, that was an augmented reality urban physical activity game. Pokemon Go is that. Okay, great, thanks, I get it, done. Right? It generates this language of exchange and of understanding between not just policymakers and civil servants, but people engaged in this, because this is open to the public, that you can then, it provides a common reference point, right? And it's also extremely effective, right? So what effective at what? Well, one, effective at helping people understand the issues. This is a digital sand table, which is simulating the future of education, or our version of a future of education. It's focusing particularly on early childhood education. And the way this works is you pile sand up on top in a little mound, and there's virtual snow at the top of the mountain, and you wave your hand and virtual rain falls down, and it runs down the side of the mountain into the valley and creates a little lake, a little pool, and you can dig your hand through the sand and it forms a little river. And all of this is based on the principles of hydrology and erosion and geography and geology. And indeed is a game-like experience without any points, but it's teaching you about these complex scientific principles, right? And it's teaching you in a social way. So those of you who are educational researchers know that, you know, play-based learning, social, interactive, constructive learning, all of these things are far more effective at communicating material than sitting in a classroom, you know, than this format right here, me talking to you, right? So I apologize, we don't have these things here to actually play with. Now, what do I mean when I say they're effective? So they're effective at actually communicating the ways and the way that the trends are changing, and then communicating a vision, an aspirational vision for how you might bring them together into a product that would improve public services or people's lives. But also, it's also a very effective persuasive tool with senior civil servants and politicians. So again, here's the Prime Minister, my boss, the Minister of Cabinet Affairs, the Minister of Higher Education. And when we were giving him a tour of this, he says, oh, this is fantastic, I get it. Like game-based play, social play, this is great. I'll take 300 of them. I was like, Your Excellency, I'm really sorry, this is not real. This is just a simulation. To which he looked at me like I was an idiot, and kind of knocked his hand on the model and said, yes, it is real. I'll take 300 of these, right? And that then the penny dropped for us when we realized that the transition from a speculative design product, which was just designed for a temporary exhibition, to an actual product which you could take to market, that is actually a trivial exercise. That is what the 20th century economy is entirely geared towards, taking ideas and bringing them to market. So we realized that we could fulfill the demand for these sort of things, thereby bringing forward these quite advanced topics around the future of education, around the future of childhood interaction, based on a simulation of that here. So speculative design is a very effective way of communicating concepts and of persuading people of a vision that this is worth actually doing. It gives them a tangible example that this thing is possible. And whilst you might not be able to do that exact thing, you can often then work backwards from that to figure out what you can do. So all of these are examples of what I like to call speculative design-led policy. You know, in the UK, the big thing when I lived here at the early 2000s was evidence-based design or evidence-based policy. You know, I don't think well, as a futurist, there are no facts about the future. There is no evidence about the future. There's forecasts, there's speculation, there's trend analysis, but none of these things are actually factual until they occur. So when you're dealing in a complex, fast-moving environment, the only thing which you can do is actually do research-informed speculation. Right? Now, research-informed speculation turns out to have a far more effective political influence than actually evidence-based policy does, for all of the reasons which I've mentioned. So this is what has gone into the Museum of the Future, which is under construction now and will open end of 2018. But I think it's important to take a pause, right? So this is what has been happening in Dubai over the last 6 years. In terms of using these tools of speculative design, design fiction, user experience design in a policy exploration and policy design context. Now, why is this something that is particularly important now? You may have noticed that we're in the middle of a giant planet-wide crisis. That everything that the 20th century built for us is falling apart left, right, and center, including our political contracts, including our infrastructure in many places, including our social contracts, their definition of what it means, who we are, what we want to do, who we want to be. And this is not just affecting the UK and the EU, this is everywhere in various ways, shapes, and forms. And this crisis has a shape, and the shape looks like this. This is, where's my laser? I don't have a laser. There we go, right? So if this curve is the 20th century, right? The systems and institutions and infrastructure of the 20th century is breaking, and it's going to continue to break at an increasing rate for some reasons which I'm about to show you about, but basically climate change. Yet the systems and institutions of the 21st century have yet to be born. Right? So the next decade, at a minimum, the next decade, certainly our entire professional lives and perhaps our children's professional lives are going to be defined by the interaction between these two paradigms. Right? The death of the 21st century, the managed decay of 20th century institutions, and the birth of 21st century institutions. And these 21st century institutions and practices and technologies, there is no right answer for how to, it's not like this is an inevitability and this is just one pathway segue into the other. This is something which has to be co-created together. Some of these things will work, some of these things will be desirable, some of these things won't be, but it's going to take at least a decade to transition into what this looks like. So this is really important because right now technology it's a truism that technology is accelerating at an exponential rate, but it's really, really true. This is a robot made by a company in America called Boston Dynamics. You may have seen the Big Dog. It's his bigger brother. This is the next generation of Big Dog. The Big Dog was about 4 times the size of this. It was on a tether. It had a diesel engine. It could only do very simple things like walk in a pre-programmed route and navigate its local environment. This is called Spot, Little Dog. And it has orders of magnitude more intelligence, orders of magnitude more sensory capabilities on it. It's not tethered, it's battery operated, it has this grasper, it interacts with its environment in intelligent ways. And this is around 18 months old, right? So it took them several years to develop Big Dog. This has now come out here, and they're already doing the next generation of this thing, which is in orders of magnitude more intelligent and more environmentally responsive. So technological change from an artificial intelligence, from an information, Internet of Things perspective, from an automation perspective, is accelerating and faster than certainly any individual understands, and certainly any regulatory environment understands, right? This has all sorts of social consequences that we're only just now starting to grapple with at the tip of the iceberg. The business models that drive, so the technology that drives the business model of Uber is one example. It's fun to bash Uber. I think Uber has actually been a net force for awesomeness around in many examples. I use Uber every day. And it's extremely problematic for certain segments of the population who use it, right? So if you're a driver, you're not a contractor, you're not an employee, and so the whole notion of the pact between labor and capital, the whole notion between managers and workers, all of that is that's a question which actually no longer bears relevance in this particular world, right? In this particular world, I'm not saying that the questions of labor have dissolved, right? But the technology behind Uber that enables Uber's business model and enables them to have grown the way they have grown and to have transformed our urban environments the way they have transformed them are utterly agnostic to these political questions of workers' rights and these sorts of things. And so this is an example of how the old institutions around the relationship of labor, things like the work week, things like wages, are decaying and becoming less and less relevant, and yet the new version of what that social contract looks like and what the economic business models around that has yet to be worked out. And so we're seeing these kinds of conflicts, right? The same is true for biology. So I'm sure you're familiar with CRISPR-Cas9. It's this genetic technology that basically enables extremely accurate, extremely fast, and extremely cheap identification of specific genes and then replacing of them. So it's cheap gene editing, cheap, fast, accurate gene editing. The Chinese are by far the best at this. And just as an example, these are 2 dogs, are brothers. They're twins. The only difference between them is that this dog had one tiny modification to a certain set of genetic expressions which accelerated its muscle growth, right? They're the exact same age. So with one simple edit, you're able to fundamentally transform this living being. And every day in biology, we're understanding more and more about how the body works, about how the brain works, about how we work together, microbiome discussions, things around cognitive science and the brain. Like, suddenly, biology becomes programmable. And this is the biggest deal ever on the history of the planet, right? This is the first time ever in the universe, as far as we know of, that a species has taken control over its own evolution and is going to be able to guide it, right? Just last year, the Chinese announced, and I say just last year they announced it because I'm sure it's been done in labs beforehand, the first CRISPR editing of a human embryo. In the UK, they just authorized, I believe it's King's College, although we need to double check that to start to do investigations using CRISPR-Cas9 on human embryos here in the UK. Beijing is literally years ahead of us. The Beijing Genomics Institute, which funnily enough is in Shenzhen, not Beijing, does more genetic sequencing in one building than the entire rest of the world combined. right? So the pace of transformation that we're about to see in life as we know it is literally impossible to understand, right? Nobody is tracking this stuff. No one knows how this is going and where this is going. So this provokes all sorts of questions around ethics, around values, around morality, around what does it mean to be a society, right? Who gets the proportional rewards of these innovations? What is legal, what is not? All these sorts of things are under question, and the most important of them, in my opinion, is climate change, because all this is taking place in the context of climate change. If you rewind the clock 20 years, and I know some of you have been active in climate change for this period, we are now living through the worst case scenario projections of 20 years ago, right? We passed 400 parts per million. 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere was about 2 years ago, is the point that climate scientists used to say was the point of no return for catastrophic climate change. We've crossed that threshold right now. And we are already seeing the early onset of increasingly severe and increasingly frequent extreme weather events, increasing droughts, increasing floods. And this is impacting things like food and water security in a way which is only going to be getting worse. And this is having profound social and political implications as well. So right now in India, in Hyderabad, the sort of Silicon Valley of India, there is, depending on who you believe, the numbers, the labor unions there say 180 million, the press is saying 80 million. There's a general strike in one of the most important city-states in India of, let's say, at least 50 million people arguing over water rights. Right? Why? Because the state privatized the water, and the company that they privatized the water to shifted those water rights to the neighboring state. And there's been a historical political rivalry between these two states. So you have literally cities burning right now in India. Just go home and Google this, like water riots India. And none of this stuff is really being reported here to the level of magnitude because, there's other problems that people are focusing on here. So we're going to see more and more of this, right? There are many people who I think there's a very strong argument that the whole Syrian civil war was precipitated by a long period of drought, which raised food prices, which sparked civil unrest. The civil unrest provoked the civil war. The civil war produced the migrant crisis, which broke the European Union, which led to Brexit. Right? So this whole kind of chain of causation, or correlation we should say, is getting faster and faster and faster. So this is not the first time that we've seen these sort of civilization-scale transformations. I mean, this happened at the end of the 19th century. This happened just before the Second World War as well. But it's characterized by this quote by Karl Polanyi in one of the most important books, I think, of the century, The Great Transformation, that he's describing not our time now, he's describing the years before the Second World War. It was a period of great transformation that rapidly destroyed old coping mechanisms and old safety nets and created new demands before new coping mechanisms are developed. Right? So this is describing the period just before the Second World War. But this is actually a wonderful description of what's happening right now. Like, we are in this period in which the old way of doing things, the old institutions and mechanisms for coping with things, for generating business value are totally decaying around us, and yet the new coping mechanisms, the new ways of going forward are unclear. So, who dreams our world? We're in this context of crisis and uncertainty. So who dreams our world? There's a great book called Sapiens, brief side diversion, Yuval Harari. If you look 70,000 years ago, there were actually 6 different species of human beings on the earth, right? Not Homo sapiens was just one of them. And in that 70,000 year period, we've then wiped out the other 6 species and became the rulers of the earth, right? Why? How did that happen? His argument is because of human imagination. Human imagination is the thing which enables us to think ahead and to go beyond the present experience that we have, and most importantly, to talk about things that don't exist. Right? Other animal species have been documented to have language, like ravens have language, parrots have language, dolphins have language, but as far as we can tell, they only talk about the physical world. They only talk about things, like rock, food, sky, right? They don't talk about ideas, because ideas aren't real. There's no physical correlation to ideas. But it's this ability to talk about things that don't exist, as he argues, is behind all of human success of the 70,000 year period. So he says if you examine any example of large-scale human cooperation, you find that it's base imaginary stories. Stories that people invent and believe and tell one another. As long as many people believe in the same imaginary story, they follow the same rules, and we can accomplish tremendous things. So this is I think this is important to reflect on in this context of civilizational transformation, because we literally live in a dream world, right? I've got some friends from Australia here. In Australia, the natives in Australia believe that there is this dream world created by the mythical beings, and we are living in their dreams. And this is not an inaccurate description, right? We literally live inside the dreams of mythical entities like the EU, the GCC, Google, Central St. Martin's, right? There is no such thing as Central St. Martin's. There is this building, right? There is that street, there are the clothes that I'm wearing, but the idea of Central St. Martin's or UAL is something which only exists in our minds as a shared idea, right? As a shared imagination. And we all agree that this is an imagination that allows us to, Lucy to send out an email, me to fly in a plane from Dubai, me to prepare these slides, you to come here at the right time, and here we are in this effort of social organization, which is only empowered by imagination. So imagination literally rules the world, and I think this is such a powerful statement in Dubai, which is a city which came up from nothing. The city was imagined from nothing, right? And these are stories that weave systems of cooperation that can cause millions of strangers to work together to create the power of their dreams. So, who dreams our world? Why is this important to ask right now? Well, because we need to dream about a new world, right? The old world is dying, and we need to literally imagine what the new world is going to look like. Historically, the church has been the primary dreamer of the world. And then, in the 20th century, it was the state, and now the market is the primary dreamer of the world. And the market, I mean advertising. So advertising has over, at this point, almost 90 years of extensive research and development and extensive investment in understanding what are the images and words and ideas which provoke people to buy the things that you want them to buy. Walter Lippmann is the father of modern advertising. He also wrote a book called Public Perception, which is also Public Opinion, which was the foundation of all of the propaganda, of methods of propaganda. There's very little difference between advertising and propaganda from a methodological perspective. And in 1912, he argues the way in which the world is imagined determines at any particular moment what people will do. Right? So we've had literally billions and 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 billions of dollars invested in trying to create a world, trying to imagine a world that will get you to buy more stuff. Right? Globally, the global advertising industry is 420 billion pounds a year. That's equivalent to 4.5 Apollo missions every year. Right? Every year we spend the equivalent of 4.5 trips to the moon on advertising to get you to feel bad about yourself so you can buy better toothpaste, to get you to feel good about yourself so you buy better shoes, whatever that might be. Right? The example which really breaks my heart is this ad. So this is Heineken. Heineken spent on the order of $30 million to create this advertising campaign. Right? It's associated with the latest James Bond movie. It's the first selfie from space. Right? $30 million to advertise beer. And then they bought, that's just not even counting media spend, that's production. And then on top of that, they spent $90 million buying advertisements to promote this thing. Right? So you spend over $100 million advertising a drink. Right? Is this the best that we can do? Right? It literally is the best we can do. When I ask who dreams the future, right now advertising is dreaming the future. Right? And it wasn't always this way, though, right? There have been moments in our history around the Apollo program, around the invention of new social contracts like, say, the NHS or the Works Projects Administration, where we collectively envisioned a new world, a different way of doing things. And we are in a time of crisis right now that needs an era of renewed public imagination. It needs big ideas behind it, right? Bold statements and strong execution that only imagination, and particularly public imagination, can deliver upon. And I think it's important because in these moments of uncertainty, actually foresight design is the most effective way, if not one of the only ways, to generate dialogue around public imagination. You cannot analyze your way into, there's no right answer, right? You cannot analyze your way into a creative idea. You actually have to be creative and develop your creative idea through a creative process. For example, the scientific method is all about understanding the question. So you understand all the aspects around a question, the rational deductive process of science is understand the question, and this is what all the policy analysis is based upon. Understand the existing conditions, understand the forces of change, try to forecast what's going to happen, and then come up with a recommendation about what is pros and cons of different policy options, right? That approach doesn't work in fast-moving uncertain environments, right? Instead, you have to try and create something from scratch. So this is where foresight and design come together in speculative design. Foresight is this process of taking the actual today and exploring what might be possible going forward. So this is this version of the classic futurist cone of expanding space of possibility going forward into the future. Design, on the other hand, is this process of actually discovering the actual, going from the possible and boiling that down through a period of exploration and experiments and prototypes and evaluation into something actual, something physical and tangible, be that a picture, be that an object, be that my shirt, be that my jacket, be that these speakers, be that this room. You're taking an idea that is possible and turning it into something actual. So speculative design is the combination of these two things, right? Where you begin with the today, something that's actual. You use creative research and design-based methods and other types of research methods to understand what might be possible going forward. And then you use that possibility to then, as your brief, if you will, to design things, to design some tangible, actual thing, some prototype, some artifact, some object, some experience, some movie, some poster, to then inform what's happening today. So it's a way of going through this process so we can better understand the changes that we're experiencing today and suggest some possible formats for that. This is super important and effective for creating policy ideas. One of my friends this morning in one of the workshops was saying, there are no more ideas in the civil service right now. And this is sort of terrified me that the rhetoric around the UK's role in the world is a return to the Commonwealth. Right? That's not a new idea, right? That's not a new idea. I would argue that's a bankrupt idea, right? And we had lunch in this restaurant nearby that was this amazing restaurant. What's it called? Dishoom, right? Awesome restaurant just downstairs. It's amazing. It's beautiful. I walked in there. I was like, this is so beautiful. I love this wood, this authentic, these stones. And I started looking at it, and it's a recreation of colonial India, right? Go down there. Like, it literally is, and it's packed. It's great food, beautiful environment, but I think it's more profound than that, right? It's appealing to this sense of let's return to the past. This is why people, like hipster artisanal coffee, and this, that's why we have beards with braids in them and all sorts of stuff. There's workers' t-shirt, workmen's shirts, and this sorts of stuff. This is this return to the past because there are no new ideas about the future, right? We don't have the public conversation about a future that we want, about a future that would be desirable, that is mindful of these trends and these challenges because our mental space is literally full of advertising junk, right? So it doesn't have to be that way, though, right? Going through this process of policy exploration, you can actually generate cool new ideas. So this was a program we did, which explored the use of drones in public services. So this guy is ordering a new government ID on his phone. That's the actual app you order it with. This goes to the actual place where it's printed out. She prints it out and puts it on a drone, and it flies to your house, right? And it flies to your house. You get it. So this is a fake. This is not real. This is a simulation that we did. This is a speculation. What could it be? How could we use technology to improve people's lives? How could we use drones to deliver public services better, right? And we shot this video in about 4 hours. It's pretty lo-fi. You can do this without a film degree, yeah? The hardest part was this shot because we couldn't get it to land very well, so we just filmed it taking off and then put it in reverse, right? It's pretty ghetto. Like, honestly, this is a one day's worth of work. And we put it on YouTube and didn't really think anything of it. And the next day, it had 3 million hits on YouTube, right? It went crazy viral. And we got more positive press than Amazon did about their drone delivery announcements. So this is important because politicians, no matter where they are, no matter what government you're in, respond to what is popular, right? So our boss realized, wow, there's something really interesting around this. And so on the back of this, in the middle of this conference, he announced this program called Drones for Good. It's a $1 million international prize to explore how you could use drones and UAVs to improve people's lives, right? And the scope of things, this sounds like a lot of money, but $1 million for commissioning consultancy reports is very, very little. I've personally been on both the paying and receiving end for management consultancy fees that are like 5 to 8 times that. What did they get at the end of it? A PowerPoint deck. What do we get out of this, right? We get 2,500 different prototypes from around the world, from over 65 different countries. And we got this whole conversation around drones in the UAE. And I think that I can't say we were responsible for, but we definitely contributed to the shift in conversation and narratives around drones from CIA assassination devices to tools that might be interesting and useful to explore what they could be used for, right? So we had judging, and the top 25 candidates came to the UAE, and they did this little race thing where they were showcasing their thing. There was organ delivery stuff, there was environmental monitoring stuff, there was disaster recovery stuff. It was really interesting and really fun, right? So suddenly we went from this speculative idea, this speculative process, to a $1 million competition, which attracted 2,500 applications, 25 of them who came to Dubai. We had something like 1,000 people from the public there. And meanwhile, in the process, we had to write some regulations around drones, because there was no regulation for UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, in Dubai. So this prompted the Civil Aviation Authority to get behind this and say, okay, what can we do? This thing is happening. What can we do to actually encourage entrepreneurship around this? And they wrote, which is one of the most progressive drone regulation policies in the world in about a period of 6 months. Right? So this approach of there is no idea, there is a vacuum which nobody knows what to do with, things are pre-legal, things are pre-political, creating a high-fidelity prototype or an experience of something which actually is persuasive and cool can have tremendous impact. Another example is this project. We did a lot of research on self-driving cars. We did 5,000-person survey, a report with the World Economic Forum on how self-driving vehicles will impact the urban environment. None of it really mattered, right? At the end of the day, we produced this video, which we call Remember Your First Ride in a Self-Driving Car. And it just simply shows the experience of getting in a car and realizing there's nobody in it. That there is no driver. And these are people like you, people like me. This is sort of regular people going about their day, having their first experience of a self-driving car. And this was about a year and a half ago or a year ago right now. Uber just rolled out their self-driving vehicles in Pittsburgh, although there's people in it because they're doing monitoring and stuff. And the combination of the research, this video, this speculative video, was the tipping point which persuaded the Roads Transport Authority that this was something that was actually happening and real and worth investing in, right? So they developed a whole strategy around this which commits Dubai to 25% autonomous trips by 2030. This is the most aggressive and ambitious self-driving vehicle strategy and target anywhere in the world. And this video was the tipping point. Right. So speculative design and high-fidelity prototyping can be an extremely powerful and effective tool for political persuasion. And that then has built beyond just speculation into all sorts of coalitions and consortiums around emerging technologies. We run now the world's largest coalition of companies, regulators, banks, and technologists exploring blockchain applications. Right, we have 46 members, including all the banks, most of the important banks in Dubai, most of the important financial regulators, most of the important multinational companies, most of the important emerging technologists and startups, and most of the important big customers in here. And what do? We just get around, we talk about it, and we decided to do some prototypes. We developed 7 pilot projects are now live. 12 more are 11 more are underway, which we can't talk about publicly. And there's some very exciting news, which we're going to announce very shortly as a result. This is our office. It's the world's first and only 3D printed building. I encourage you to come here. Right? Again, something that was a pure speculation. By doing a prototype based in partnerships with different companies and suppliers, we developed this thing. And on the back of the tangible expression of this thing, so we're moving from a speculative prototype to a real-world prototype, the city committed to 25% of all buildings will be 3D printed by 2030. Starting next year, if the plans go through, to get a building permit, you have to have 2% of anything in your building 3D printed. It could be your doorknobs, it could be your toilet seats, it could be whatever. And every year, you're going to have a 2% increase year by year on that until we hit the target. Right? So this is actually a very different approach to thinking and engaging about the future. Right? And I like to call this, borrowing from Mariana Mazzucato, of course, like the imaginative state, or maybe, in fact, the visionary state. This is a very different understanding of the roles of the state's role in creating the future and co-creating the future. It's a role which requires you to use speculation to actively engage with these topics ahead of the time. You're not just waiting until some horrible catastrophe happens and then you have to roll out some draconian regulation because you don't actually understand it and you haven't been paying attention to it, right? You're proactively exploring the issues of today, and you're using the tools of modern media and design to create a demand for their realization. And I think this is a really important point, right? This isn't just idle, directionless speculation about what might be, right? Some of these things are designed to be exploratory communicative tools to raise the issues that it will deal with, but this is goal-driven, or as Mariana Mazzucato says, mission-driven, right? We know that we are facing a huge food and water crisis. We know that we're going to face a giant migration crisis. We know that we're going to face sea level rise and all sorts of political and social and economic instability that's going to come with that, right? The problems are clear. Right? What isn't clear is and in many cases the solutions are clear too. What is lacking is the political willpower to actually do something about this. So in these times of uncertainty, in these periods of transition, speculative to design, applied with political sensitivity and political intelligence, should be goal-driven, right? You're trying to suggest a specific solution that who knows, it might not work in the long run, but it should be tested, right? And most importantly then, the visionary state takes action to deliver these promises. This isn't just a consultative process, right? This isn't just a visioning process. This is an execution component as well. So you explore what might happen in the future, you develop prototypes around that, you shape a vision or a narrative of how you want that to occur, and then you do something about it, right? So the visionary state is a state that derives its legitimacy during a period of time and change from proactive engagement from the future. This is a very different definition of the state. This is not state as regulator, right? And I'm going to quote from this wonderful book. I hope you've read it, Entrepreneurial State. It had a nice big buzz here in the UK because Mariana Mazzucato was at Sprue. It hit the sort of Economist in the press last year, more or less, and I think the buzz has sort of died down, but I still see some of her. I think this is one of the most profound books of the 2010s, right? We'll see what's yet to come. She defines this as the entrepreneurial state, which is, I'm modifying the entrepreneurial state for a futurist orientation. A state is entrepreneurial, I'm going to say visionary, when it shifts its identity away from notions of being just a regulator or an administrator and towards being a visionary actor or a prime mover of change. A state is entrepreneurial when it is able and willing to invest in areas of extreme uncertainty, courageously envisioning the direction of change across public agencies and departments. And a state is entrepreneurial when it welcomes, rather than fears, high risk and uncertainty in the innovation process, right? Most importantly, a state is entrepreneurial when it thinks big. Right, so I just want to end on this. This is my favorite book from 1970s, Universal Traveler. The back cover says, design is a process of making dreams come true. Right? Design is a process of generating options out of nothing, right? Of articulating those in a way that is preferable or desirable. And then executing on that is a process of making those dreams come true. And this is exactly what we need right now in these periods of uncertainty and transition and chaos, right? Because it's going to get worse. It's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, right? But we have the luxury and the opportunity right now to try to envision what the better might look like and help to midwife that transition through. So, there's these three things that this technology or this approach enables. It helps government and the public understand the forces of technological and social change that they're experiencing in a way which is not like the sort of visceral dread which you might feel as an Uber driver to the future of automation, knowing that Uber has publicly committed to putting you out of a job as soon as it can with self-driving vehicles, right? It helps create this positive common vocabulary, which I call public imagination. And we develop pilot projects and partnerships to help make these real. So this is the Dubai context. This is something which we've been developing in application over the last 5 years, borrowing from things like critical design, borrowing things like design fiction. I don't think it's inaccurate to say that we have the largest, most impactful, and most advanced practice of speculative design in the world. Very few people are paying attention to it, but what's interesting about it is as this starts to roll out, as more and more people have to deal with the kinds of conditions we've been dealing with in the UAE, it's going to create several questions. So what does this look like in other countries? Right? What does this look like in other governance conditions? What does this look like with more participation? Now, honestly, I have mixed feelings about participation. I've been an urban planner for most of my young career. Participation is generally two things. One, a political rubber stamp to try to show that you've consulted people, and you're usually pushing through what you want to push through anyway. Or two, a genuine effort to try and include people's opinions and ideas, and then you get the classic design by committee outcome, right? I don't think the visionary state, I could be wrong, this is my hypothesis, I don't think the visionary state is participatory. And the other question is, what does it look like at different price points? Now, actually, the stuff I've shown you is very sort of high gloss, but it's relatively inexpensive. We're talking less than a McKinsey PowerPoint deck, right? And it's extremely effective in terms of its return on investment or its return on political capital. But that said, it's still done at a national scale, right? It's still done with 7 or 8 months of intensive involvement of designers and intensive involvement in experimentation with technologists and testing and refinement and making sure it all works so it works very well. But what does that look like in a 1-week version where you're just doing it with your neighborhood with 100 quid, right? What does that look like in a 2-month version where you're doing it with a couple £1,000 or 50,000 pounds or something, right? These are all questions which I think as this technique begins to roll out, and I think it is going to be increasingly used by people around the world. I'm very pleased to see this being used in the Cabinet Office here and the Policy Lab and elsewhere. Singapore has been doing this for quite a while. Australia is experimenting with this. Canada, in various ways. Not so much the US yet. But the approach is so useful that I think we're going to see more of it. And these are the questions which we're going to start to explore. So that's my daughter. This is her looking at the future of education, the Mars Dome, which is a telepresence automated a learning experience. And that's the facial expression which we're trying to create, right? This is what we want when we think about the future. We want that look of awe and excitement and joy, not the look of terror and fear and resignation, which many of us experience. So I'd love for you to come visit us in Dubai. We hope we can imagine a better future together.
So thank you so much for having me as well. So for those of you who don't know, Demos is one of probably about half a dozen kind of political think tanks swimming around in the waters of Westminster. And our jobs mainly are in far less extravagant ways than yours to try and keep our politicians up to date with as much evidence and research as we possibly can to kind of inform them as they make the decisions that they do on our behalf. So kind of to begin, kind of speaking as someone who generally, as a job, has to convince politicians using boring old reports and PDFs, I can firstly kind of only really look on in jealousy at a presentation which includes a nano toothbrush, a smart fork, 2 types of robotic dog, a cheery gingerbread man, that you saw at the very beginning that was kind of dancing over lava, a 3D printer house, and all these other things which we could only imagine to be able to create within the UK policy context and using public funding. Now, I'm going to draw out 3 different observations. The third and the first are somewhat related, which are really just aspects of this talk, which I thought it was worthwhile just to dwell on a few minutes more. And the first is that kind of underneath all of that unfamiliarity, that kind of bleeding edge kind of future gazing and future building. Actually, the policy context which that interacts with is actually very familiar and similar to our own. Because likewise within the UK, there are mantras that have swept through the civil service over the last few years. And the first of them is digital by default. The idea that we use a digital world and we build digital technologies and digital services as the best way of making government both reactive and agile to its citizen needs. This is the best way of us saving money. It's the best way of supplying government services across the board. And all government services should be digital unless there's a very good reason why they shouldn't be. So digital by default too in the UK has changed the way in which government tries to deliver the services that it needs to its citizens. The second is evidence-based policy making, and an interesting interaction here, I think, in the talk that Noah gave is the interactions between data and truth and research with the ability to dream big dreams and imagine new concepts and be creative and generative as well, as much as we are kind of descriptive and fact-based. But of course, one of the huge changes which technology has actually made within government and continues to make, and this is only going to get quicker, is the way in which it changes how government understands which policies work, which policies are having the effects that they want. And evidence-based policy making in practice means that government is in a frenzy to collect more data than ever before, to combine more data sets than ever before, and to interrogate and squeeze every single drop of insight it can out of those data sets in order to understand what its policies are doing, what seems to be working, and how it needs to make and what decisions it should make across pretty much anything that we can imagine now within central government and local government as well. So evidence-based policy making. And the last one, and this is the one which is least familiar, I think, to this talk, is the mantra of more for less. I mean, the UK policy context is perhaps very different in how pressured it has been over its budgets. Of course, since the 2008 crisis, when government committed to reducing about a third out of central departmental spending. But then now we have the double problem that at the same time as government actually having to reduce the amount of money it spends on civil servants, it spends on the whole machinery that makes policies, that takes decisions, we've also got to handle Brexit at exactly the same time. And the civil service, from my own experience of working with government, has never felt like it's been under greater pressure than it is now. At the same time as dealing with what they regard to be literally a generational challenge over negotiating our way out of the EU. We've got to do all of this with less money. And that's an area I think actually that working in the UK actually causes politicians and civil servants' ears to prick up actually more than the other two. Are there ways of actually delivering these policies for less money? Are there ways of saving money out the civil service? Are there ways of saving money out of the whole process and machinery of government? That is an incredibly important coalface when government is thinking about how it adopts the technologies that it does and how it changes the way in which it makes policies. So firstly, some familiar things. Reflection number 2 was really about how designing fiction, a phrase I loved, used several times, is actually also about designing fact. Now, these changes, these mantras, these differing ways in which government is going about trying to change decisions and trying to make itself more creative, more risk-taking, more daring in some cases, and to save money in others, is causing a cultural shift in the civil service. I think in some ways you've been part of this shift, but I've noticed it in the sense that there are more people with kind of designer jackets and thick-rimmed glasses that know about data, and there's more of them than ever before going into central government departments, and they are wrenchingly changing the culture in which civil service departments work. Partly through the use of data, partly through thinking around data and other sources of evidence. Recently, I was in a central government department, and on the wall was reflected a data dashboard. This was a new thing. It was being driven by the Government Digital Service and central parts of the Cabinet Office and the Government Office of Science. It was a new thing. They were doing this all around. It was a small team of trailblazers that were going around doing this. What they were doing is they created a series of real-time data inputs. They mashed these all together. They'd actually thrown some pretty sophisticated analytics, machine learning at it. And it was a real, live, changing thing, 12 foot across on the wall of the Central Government Department office with their changing key indicators of how well they were doing on it. And what struck me about that, and this actually relates to an interest which Demos has, and I think it was really important kind of theme coming out of the use of design in policy making, is how the truth that dashboard painted actually was constructed with design principles. And the way that is designed changes the very basic truths that a government department has on how well it's doing and what it needs to be doing and the decisions that it needs to take, even down to the very basic of the graphics, the colours that the data is presented in, how large they are on the screen, and of course all the other things that you don't see around the screen too. So I've been musing, and I think it's really important, the way in which design actually is a series of political decisions which are often wrapped up, a series of assumptions, a series of decisions about what is important and what isn't, a series of decisions about how it can be analysed and what should be analysed and why and how. So designing fiction, also about designing fact, and this has only become more important, I think, the role of design in making clear and visible a world which is increasingly complex. Whether that is about unbelievable amounts of data, whether it's about trends and new social developments which are happening all the time more quickly than they ever have before. We're throwing more and more design at that to actually paint new windows, which we need with our tiny human brains. To actually try and understand a world which is increasingly more difficult to be understood. Reflection number 3 is digital exclusion. Now, I'm a techno enthusiast, generally speaking. I generally believe that technology has made our lives better and will increasingly do so. I think that the powers that we have at our fingertips mean that we are the most powerful human beings that have ever walked the planet. And the things that we can do would have sent a Roman emperor into a paroxysm of jealousy, much the way that all those amazing prototypes sent me into a similar paroxysm of jealousy. The technology is in general, I think, a good thing, and it is improved lots of things to do with our lives, which we could only dream about a generation ago. But the other aspect of the digital world, apart from its pace, the other aspect of the digital revolution, apart from how deep it's become in our lives, is actually how unequal it is. Now, not everybody has been invited to the party, and what I think is most difficult and most worrying, and what we try and work on demonstrates quite a lot, is that the kind of horrible paradox is that the very people, the poorest, the most underprivileged, the people that are most vulnerable, that you really want technology to really help, are also the people that are least likely to organically pick up that technology, whatever it is, social media platform, new kind of analytics technology, driverless car, and actually use it. And that has meant in the UK, I'm going to come back to this point right at the end, because I think this actually is related to consent and participation, but that has meant in the UK that not everyone's felt like they've been invited to the party. And if you take various important parts of various segments of these new technologies. So let's take data analytics again and data privacy. Actually, if you ask most people about that, they will feel that is a revolution that is being done to them, not a revolution which they are taking part in. So there's big questions to do with power here. There's big questions to do with how you actually, I think really fundamentally, also use design, not only to make these amazing new services, not only to build new things which we can see can certainly change people's lives, but how do you build these things so that everyone can use them? And whether that's business model, whether that's actually how the thing works, how the thing looks, how do you open these things up as well? And how, in a sense, like, you know, I'm sure many people in this room, certainly in my work, you know, work with lots of technologies every day, and the things that technologies can do now and are going to do in the future are amazing, and it's easy to get lost into that actually very small social bubble. And actually forget that for many people across the UK, the digital revolution and other allied technological revolutions are actually quite bewildering and scary. And design's role in bringing those people along with us for the ride, I think, is massively vital as well. Right, finally, kind of global crisis. I mean, I agree. I agree with almost everything that Noah said. I mean, I think we are living through an era of kind of profound institutional disruption. We can see, you know, political parties are being ripped apart. We can see, very worryingly, actually, that two things seem to be happening side by side. First, the threats are getting quicker and they're changing quicker. But then second, our capacity to actually respond to those threats seems to be getting worse. And partly this is the way in which political parties are being battered. Partly it's to do with a diminishing consensus within mainstream politics. Partly it's got to do with this kind of, for many different reasons within the UK and across so many different societies now, a kind of deep ingrained kind of hatred and repudiation of mainstream politics and professional politics, and really kind of like a profound desire to look elsewhere for how decisions should be made and who makes them. Trump in the UK, Trump in the US. To some extent, Corbyn was part of that revolution as well, right? Rejecting a Labour Party consensus which has been around for 15 years. We're going to see this process get quicker and quicker. I mean, I don't know if anyone's heard of Beppe Grillo, but here's an Italian politician who came out of nowhere to successfully contest the elections in Italy. You know, he built his political party using meetup groups, the machinery. He didn't speak to the press. He had the most popular blog in Italy. He didn't take any big business donations. He used the digital means to do that too, especially small money donations. And he took on and beat the mainstream political parties. And this is only going to get quicker. And I think Corbyn's only the beginning. I think in the next 5 years we're going to see someone a hell of a lot more disruptive than Corbyn enter the British political scene. There's so little time people to mainstream parties now. So all of that really important and very worrying. And of course, the power of imagination tied to what technology now makes possible has to be part of the solution to that. In fact, no, the only thing that I disagreed with, and this is the point I wanted to end on, is in the importance of participation. And I'm not sure necessarily whether that's participation in actually making the technology itself, and I'm not sure what form that participation should take. But Demos is a big fan of participation, and we are sceptical of centres and concentrations of power, and we like trying to find ways of exploding them and making them more porous. And if the current processes don't work in terms of both bravely reaching for the future, then new ones have to be built because people have to be brought along for the ride. So that was the kind of the parting comment was in the importance of design there as well. Design in process as well as in thing. Design in politics as well as in prototypes. Like kind of trying to design new ways of actually trying to build the consensus wherein these technologies have to work and to build the understanding within a society of these technologies which they're going to have to operate within. Because that's to connect kind of the theme of the first half of your talk with the second, that is the deep worry, which is that technology is only going to get quicker. What is possible is only going to get more extravagant. The possibilities are already endless, only become even more endless. You know, we see a universe of possibility in front of us now. At the same time as all the institutions around us for creating consent, for involving people in the whole process, for collectively coming to decisions about actually what kinds of technologies we as a society, ethically, morally, operationally simply want to have. All of those institutions are coming under greater threat than ever before, as is lawmaking. You know, I mean, God, we can't even make the law quick enough anymore to keep half the technologies under decent amounts of regulation. Look at legal highs. I mean, people just redesign the drugs every week. You know, it takes months to put these things through Parliament, primary legislation. So that's the worry, and that's where design, just to finish, I know I'm going over time, that's where design is going to be really important as well, is in connecting up institutional malaise and decay with technological bravery and imagination, and trying to work out ways of that being an imagination for all of society, and that being something which all of society feels brave about, and not actually really terrified of. Because there's much to be scared of here as well. So, but I thought it was an absolutely brilliant talk, and I'm going to be the first in the queue to coming to your 3D printed offices, because that is amazing. Can I just ask one point of clarification just before I end? Was that all buildings are going to have a mandate of the proportions can be 3D printed?
Yeah. So every you won't get a building permit unless a portion of the building is 3D printed.
Amazing. So yeah. Thank you, Noah, for that. That was so interesting and well worth missing, even a sunny Friday afternoon in London.
High praise. Thank you. I'm sorry.
And thank you, Carl, for that very vivid response. Okay, so we have until about 7 o'clock. If you could use the mic, because we are trying to record this for posterity, and if you could say a little bit just about who you are, that would be helpful as well. Were you putting your hand up?
I'm Rosa. I study anthropology of design at UCL. So I was also caught by when you said, I don't think innovation decisions are participatory. And I think it's interesting. I wanted you to talk a little more about it, because I was wondering if it is in the sense that it's something that you have to believe, and sometimes other people don't believe in. I don't know if that's why you say it. And also I was wondering, do you think that innovative ideas get participatory as it gets commercialized in a broader scale? So in the sense that it becomes open to validation by more individuals and then bought or accepted, then it actually goes from speculation to reality. So it's commercialization and consuming an important part of validating that idea.
So let me define maybe what I mean by participation. Because I think it was rightly said that certainly we have more capability from a creative perspective to generate new ideas and new businesses and everything. And that is, in some senses, an inherently participatory process, right? But participation has taken on these sort of mantra sense, particularly in policy over the last, call it, decade or two, call it 2 decades more or less, which has been a response to the literal and physical and political exclusion of minority communities, minority in a larger sense, right, from the policymaking process. In the American context in urban planning, this is, people of color not being able to get jobs and get mortgages in certain neighborhoods, and unfair pricing policies vis-a-vis public transportation, and underinvestment in public transportation, and then people who are subject to those policies not being able to actually have a say in the planning of their city and environment, right? So as a response, this drive for participation, participatory planning, participatory governance sort of rose to the fore as this idea is like, I don't want to be subjected to your vision of the future, right? Like I should have some agency in my life. Now, I want to differentiate between, when I say I don't think the future will be participatory, I don't mean to say that the future will lack individual agency. I completely agree 100% with you that right now, individuals and small groups have more agency than they have ever had, maybe ever, right? And I think this is true net across society, even the most, I don't want to say even the most, but certainly as you go further down into socioeconomic brackets, for example, even mostly poor and disadvantaged communities still have access to extraordinary resources and extraordinary ability to do things, right? And I think that as we go forward, we want to, this is my whole point when I mean public imagination, we want to empower people to have the tools and the ability to say, this is what the future that I want, this is what I want the future to be like, right? But that works best in small groups. Right. There's no such thing, and my PhD is literally on participatory, crowdsourced policymaking. Like you can Google it right now and you'll find it, right? And what you find is that the more people are involved in these kinds of policy discussions, the less effective they are, right? This is not a numbers game, right? So the UN right now has after the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Development Goals, ended, and then they had this now sustainable development goals, and they did this huge participatory process around the world. They call it the largest crowdsourcing process ever. I don't know how many people were consulted, but it was 20, 30 million people or something. Joy, maybe you can help me. It was huge, right? And what did they get out of it? What did they get out of it? They got 8 utterly vapid, meaningless words, right? What is it? What does sustainable get do? Okay, we want our jobs. We want justice, and we want education, and we want clean environments, and and like that. Those are meaningless, right? That is meaningless. So I actually think this is one of the paradoxes of the 21st century: is that whilst our decisions are spread across so many people, we can have such huge impact, right? The actual power lies in small groups, right? And what's interesting, Moises Naomi, I liked your point about this. It's like power is easy to get but hard to hold, right? So it's gonna, and this is your comments on the future of British politics, I think, are spot on. I mean, because I fear the same thing about Trump in the United States, for example. Even if he doesn't win, what happens next is going to be even worse. And this is, exactly, very few people remember the politician that preceded Mussolini in Italy, but he was like a Trump-like kind of character, and only after did Mussolini come into power. So, but I think that's a good thing, because as in this gap, this decade-long gap, it's going to be a giant bloody fight. It's going to, and I hope it's not literally a bloody fight, but it's going to be a giant contest of ideas and visions of the future as more and more people have access to more and more power and more ability to express those visions, right? And that's going to be a good thing, because that's the only way, if you look at this from a design perspective or an entrepreneurship perspective, only by letting 1 billion parallel experiments thrive and play are you going to see the ones that are going to eat the other ones, and those are going to gradually survive and gradually build up towards a little bit more stable and robust. And it's only by letting this sort of genie out of the bottle are we going to be able to navigate our way into the 21st century, right? So when I say I don't believe the future is participatory, I mean that in the literal technical sense of policy participation. And I'm going to come up with an urban plan for you, or I'm going to come up with a policy plan for you, and I'm going to invite you to a coffee session or a tea session in the evening, and you tell me what you think about it. Right? And then I'm going to take your advice back, and the public policy consultants are going to then integrate your advice and generate some proposal that comes from that. That is a untrue process, right? And I very much appreciate your point on data, and I think this is one of the interesting issues, because like Jerry Rivette's at the Oxford, at the, what do they call it now? The Center.
Oxford Internet Institute.
Institute for, it used to be called the James Martin School. Now it's something else, right? He's got this notion of post-normal science, and the idea that our world, our political world in particular, is post-factual, right? Plausibility, our friend Graham Lester at the International Future Forum, plausibility is more important than actual fact, right? That's what defines politics. That's why design is so powerful, because you can have Nigel Farage standing in front of a picture of immigrant hordes, right? And saying we're going to save £350 million a week on the NHS, right? And that sounds more plausible than any facts, right? At the same time, we have more access to facts than ever, and we're able to try and manage that and integrate that, right? So, I think design trumps data for now, and I think it will continue to do so for a little while. But until the data becomes more, people become more savvy at dealing with data. But anyway, I'm rambling. That's what I mean. I hope, did I answer that question? Like, I really think, I think power is going to be more distributed, and the definition of the future is going to be more broadly based, and that's why I say we need an era of public imagination. But at the end of the day, I think that works best in small groups, and it's not a large group process. Yeah. Sorry, do you want to respond to that? Let me tell you.
So my name is Jeff Masters. I guess I'm kind of like an old style policy wonk who sort of believed more in data and more kind of trying to make sense of this new world of design. Design trumps data, right? But more importantly for this discussion, I actually am working now with Marina Mazzucato. So I was interested to see that you commented on her book nicely, kindly. But particularly, I guess one of the questions that and we're working on a project about how to take forward her work more practically, which perhaps I'll talk to you about afterwards. But one of the questions that she is kind of struggling with is this question of legitimacy to act. Mm-hmm. How do states have the space to act? Now, clearly in the context that you work, and you took us right back to 1971 and showed the strong belief that there was about the can-do attitude of the state, which has given it, and by earning that right through doing things well over that time, it has continued to earn more rights to act. But in other contexts, that opportunity space for the state doesn't always exist. And the kind of the rules that govern the policy environment that many states operate in, sort of market failure approach to thinking about policy very much constrains what governments are kind of allowed to do. So I guess my question is partly about your observation about that, how outside of the context of the state that you're working in, where it's kind of given that the state does have the right to do this kind of stuff, how can that space be created in other contexts, perhaps like the UK, where the role of the state is always more constrained?
I think that's the defining question of the next decade, right? Particularly for the UK, and I guess I'm not an expert in UK politics or policy, but I would say that that failure of imagination that has produced the context of limited degrees of freedom and inability to act is the result of a vision of the role of state in society that came from 80 years of advertising, right? And there's no truth to that in any objective sense. In the same way that there's no truth to the legitimacy of other states or of any ideas. This is a social agreement, and as such, it can be reimagined, right? And this is why I think design is so powerful as a tool for generating. We can reimagine if you look at behind it, we can reimagine the role of the state in society, and state in the citizen, and the role of the citizen in relation to the market, and the role that the market plays, right? And behind all of these examples, it thrives in this highly legitimate state, which is dedicated to public goods, right? But you can envision that and prototype that through design and through experiences in such a way that people think, oh, wait, that's not a bad idea, right? Like, I kind of like having a healthcare system. I kind of like having trains. Like, I would love it if the state came in and refurbished my house and put solar panels on that and made it less moldy, right? And the only reason that people don't demand that is because there isn't a public conversation around that is backed up with persuasive media and convincing examples, right? So I think this is super powerful as an approach because that your job then becomes simulating, prototyping what a new, bolder vision of the state would look like. Like, what would it actually do? How would it actually interact? What is the next baby step with which it could increase its freedom of movement a little bit and gain a little bit more legitimacy step by step by step? Because that's the only way we've been able to do this here. It didn't, none of this was given to us. Like, we had to first start out with a little paper prototype and then a poster, and then you gradually build on that. And we were lucky to have extraordinary leaders who wanted that, and it fit with a larger vision. But I would just encourage you and all of us in the room, like, let us reimagine the role of the state in society, right? Let us imagine that the state actually has some authority to enact public goods, right? It is, and it's not just the realm of market failure. That there is, optimism, hope, and opportunity there, and let's imagine what that might look like, and let's try to articulate that with as much forceful and precise expression as we possibly can, because then that becomes a sort of inspiring thing to galvanize around, If any politician could come up with an inspiring vision of an alternative to Brexit, then they would have, right? But they can't, they didn't, and it's up to you, us, all of us together, to try to articulate a vision of a society in which there is, inclusiveness, or in which there is open borders, or whatever the issue might be, right? And then try to boil that down to what is the design intervention which you can make that is kind of bold and inspiring enough to get people's blood flowing, but also tangible enough that people could really get, it has credibility. I think that's the fine line.
I think the key question is risk appetite, because at various points in time, we've had a state which spent 70% of the GDP. I mean, we politically redraw the line all the time between where we think the kind of like the legitimate role of the state ends and only markets and private activity can begin. But I think that the difference between, say, just this conceptually, like theoretically for a moment, about what the state should be and what it should do, like the difference between, say, a state which is running the commanding heights of the economy and setting up the healthcare system, nationalising the rail, steel, and so on, and the entrepreneurial state is that the entrepreneurial state is a state that can take risks, You know, and I can't think of a single point in history where our state has acted like a first stage venture capitalist. You know, nor necessarily do I actually necessarily think that is what the state should be doing. I mean, hands up, I think there are some, you know, legitimate questions over the extent to which states can take risks in those areas, and the extent because if who's taking the risk and who's paying for it in the end of the day. I mean, there's good reasons why states are risk averse, and it's because voters don't like their money being wasted at all. You know, so I think there's difficulties there, but definitely in terms of states like helping entrepreneurial cultures to flourish and helping new technologies get off the ground, that is, as you said, like just one of the most defining questions for the next 10 years. You know, and states are required there. So, you know, the history of the internet, you know, is one of the state going in hard early and then getting out of the way as soon as it began to pick up. And I think there's going to be so many more technologies like that in the future, which are only going to be able to be helped through those very early stages with heavy state involvement. That is something which actually I personally wouldn't say the Conservative government from a kind of market point of view is actually particularly adverse to. I think they are interested in creating more entrepreneurial cultures. They're definitely interested in the UK being a market leader in things like graphene, big data analytics. They want they'd love some social media unicorns to come from the UK as well. I think there is a failure around new ideas though for that. Definitely, because the state at the moment is working through the same old kinds of mechanisms it always has. So regulation, some tax incentivization, and like, has anyone ever gone for an Innovate UK grant here? Yeah. How did you find the paperwork?
I've had worse.
Well, I've had better. I mean, I found so the Innovate UK is like one of these grants that government it's like middle way house. Yeah. It's like public funding for companies to innovate and take risks which they couldn't do just on the market because it's too risky. That's like one of these kind of structures the government's created, and like some of that is just so difficult. I mean, I spent a third of my time on the paperwork around risk mitigation, and so I think there's new structures that need to be created around all of this. So that was an incredibly waffly answer, but I think it's around risk really, risk appetite.
But it's also I would so the entrepreneurial state started out as a publication of demos, right? So,
yeah.
Back in the day, before it was a book, it was a baby publication of demos.
Well, I wasn't going to claim that. Maybe ungracious for me to say.
I'd encourage you to read it because what it's pointing to is not what the state does, you know, as a venture capitalist, but what the state does in solving big problems early on in those early stages when it's really uncertain and you don't know what's going to come from it. But it's focusing on the problems that need to be solved. That from that the technologies emerge. So it's at that stage where the state has a particular role dealing with what Mariner Muscato talks about as Knightian uncertainty, quantifiable risk, which is beyond the realm of a private company to manage because there's no reason to do it. They have no reason to solve these big, broad public problems, which citizens demand to be solved. So that's why the state should do it. It's not because they're the best venture capitalists. That's the fundamental misunderstanding.
But let me elaborate on that because I think that look at in America, for example, the space program, the Apollo program, is the archetypical mission-oriented public investment, right? And to your point, it's like, of course, voters hate having their money wasted, but that's because government usually does such a boring, shitty job at using their money, right? Like when John F. Kennedy stands up and says, we choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, because it's hard, spines go up, like my spine tingles today when I hear that, right? That is an amazing, inspiring vision that we're gonna do something that is both risky and awesome and important, and it's gonna cost a hell of a lot of money. They estimate something like 7 to 12% of the US GDP went to the Apollo program for that period of time, and it might blow up. It blew up several times, but damn it, it's important and it's right and it's awesome. And people flocked to him, right? It's like Shackleton in his classic ad about getting sailors to go to the South Pole. Dangerous, return not guaranteed, difficult, privation, may die, may have to eat your colleagues, etc. And he was overwhelmed with applications because it's an awesome, inspiring vision. So I think if government took the lead around awesome, inspiring visions, then people would there's so much money out there. The government spent £1 billion on consultants last year, right? The UK government, money follows good ideas and inspiring visions ultimately, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, little rant, so apologies.
You just answered all my questions, really. But I just wanted to sort of raise something about identity, because I kind of think that you said that 95% of the citizens actually work for the government. And I think the same is probably true in Estonia as well. So it's like another sort of very progressive state who and I wondered about sort of cultural factors in that, because it's kind of like there is obviously a national identity within both of those. Like I suppose it's a city-state, but also Estonia's 7 million people, so it's tiny. So it's kind of like the role of not necessarily participation, but sort of like I suppose identity and sort of like national sovereignty in that. It's kind of like how you like see technology engaging with those sorts of issues. I mean, because they're kind of part and parcel of the same thing. They kind of it's a catch-22, and like one leads to the other, like this big dream. But it's like how do we engage people initially with the state to allow them to sort of like dream those sorts of things? I mean, if you kind of I'm waffling again, but you kind of think going back to your idea of like dreams. There's that really famous quote from George Bush's aide about like creating reality, and so it's kind of like how do we like now, what is going to be the flashpoint in this country particularly for those sorts of things to start happening? Because I mean, it's kind of I don't know. Is it enough to do it in this context, or does it need to have something bigger?
Well, I mean, I think there's a very, very accurate and realistic small state advantage. I mean, Vinay talks about this very well. It's like Estonia, Singapore, the UAE. These are city-state. These are scales in which I've been in rooms where everybody that has any influence over decision is in the same room. Scotland, exactly. Iceland, right? So these.
Platforms as opposed to sort of like Westphalian models of sort of like nation states.
So that's an interesting question, right? So you have these geographic scale benefits for small state advantages, right? But what does that look like on the web? Yeah. All right. I mean, that would be the only thing I can think of as an alternative to that, because there's no way. I mean, London has 14 million people in it now, 13 million people, 12. Who knows?
7.
8. In Greater Metro, the M25.
10.
Really? I thought it was 12. Anyway, sorry, a lot, right? More than Estonia. Getting all of us to agree on anything is bloody impossible. But you could create easily 100,000 like-minded people online and galvanize around a powerful message and inspiring vision that could then cascade to 100 million people or 1 billion people within a matter of days, right? So I think that's the space in which many of these visions might articulate themselves. It's small state advantages in stateless, non-geographic environments. But I'm speculating. I have no idea.
Okay, there's a question here.
Hi, I'm Nathan. I do software companies for digital collaboration and foresight and stuff. So, I mean, one thing that occurs to me, and I hate to be the one who brings this up, but you're kind of approaching a taboo in Western politics. I think about the Apollo program, and that was inspiring, but it was inept from a media perspective. So by the time of Apollo 13, it wasn't broadcast because the network said that NASA had made going to the moon more boring than doing your taxes, and so that was inspiration, but not media savvy. And I think the last time that we had a truly inspiring and media savvy government in the West was in the early 1930s with kind of bad consequences. And ever since then, this idea of the citizenry reinventing government is something that is politically saleable, but the notion of government reinventing the citizenry, not so much. And so, in the case of something like UAE, where you have, arguably relatively enlightened rulers, that get the consent of the governed through, having their finger on the pulse of people in a very, very subtle way, that's all right. But historically, that's very, very rare, and what you see instead, it tends to be a lot worse. So I guess, how can government actually take that role without the catastrophic scenarios unfolding?
So that's an awesome question, right? Let's play dystopias for a little while. I mean, the Chinese call this the good emperor problem. When you have a good emperor, life is great. When you have a bad emperor, a generation of life sucks. And the good emperor problem, particularly in technological realms, right, is very profound. Like we did a scenario exercise for a couple of museums ago. I might have to ask you not to broadcast this stuff because this is getting interesting, but it's worth the conversation around the role of biotechnology and biological engineering in large-scale behavior modification, right? I mean, we know now that pheromones are profoundly influential on our levels of trust and our levels of affinity and our fear response, our risk response, our anger response, all these sorts of things. We're within years, if somebody hasn't found out already how to manufacture those biological responses, right? And so, you know, we gamed out a very horrible scenario in which we were sort of biologically enslaved to a certain master class, right? You know, that's not unfeasible, right? I mean, this as horrible that is. Or you think same thing with hive minds or human augmentation. Like somebody might just get so damn smart so quickly that they just literally dominate the market and take over politics and, you know, control the whole country, right? Or whatever that might be. So, you know, I think that how do we guard against that? I have no idea. I don't know. I just think, but I think we have to try to encourage as many people to understand and be savvy about these issues and try to expose the tools of digital production and vision making to as many people as possible, so that is a scenario, which is a very real scenario that people are aware of and actively work against, right? And the biohacking community is a very interesting example of this, because you know, in the US they have the iGEMs, the International Genetic Engineering Machines. It's a bunch of high school students, right? The technology moves so fast that the FBI came to them trying to ask them for understanding about how someone might create a pathogenic plague virus, right? Teenagers, right? And they self-regulated because they realized this was going to be quite a risky zone, but only because they knew it so well. And you can create a glowing yogurt or a Prozac potato or whatever that might be, right? You realize how close we are to these sort of dystopian scenarios. So I can only hope that the more people have access to the tools and the more education and understanding we have around what they can and can't do and what the real risks are, that we would be able to have a more informed and intelligent conversation around that, right? Because I certainly wouldn't want to leave that up to government to decide.
Okay, very quickly, because we need to finish.
Hi, my name's Jeremy Evans. I'm researching fisheries and marine conservation. Very interesting talk there. I was particularly curious to think beyond the visionary state and concepts around the tragedy of the commons, and a term I came across from you was about collapse dynamics and the problems within particularly the marine commons. And I'm interested in kind of marine participation, how to get people more involved in kind of questioning, understanding the deep sea ecosystems and the high seas, which go beyond sort of the visionary state, because they're beyond the state, and also Antarctica, the North Pole. And so I'm not particularly fluent with all these visions of digital mechanisms, but I'd like to sort of get some suggestions perhaps on emancipatory mechanisms for creating digital platforms to get people to participate in decision making on the deep sea.
Let's see. That's a fascinating question. Two angles there. Just one, you know, the solar. This is a story which Vinay tells better than I do, right? That plummeting prices of solar, increasing breakthroughs in desalination plants, the ability to have self-building buildings soon, like the notion that you'd be able to create new communities, cities, towns, and countries or micronations outside of traditional sovereign bounds is within the realm of possibility now, right? And will increasingly be so soon, right? And you look at digital economies and currencies. Yeah. Just go somewhere that was uninhabitable beforehand, and you have your bug farms and your desal plant and whatever that might be, or on the ocean or whatever that might be, right? So that's super interesting. But I think the essence of your question is around these sorts of collective management type of questions. You know, I mean, I think the tragedy of the deep sea and the high sea is that nobody thinks about it. Like, it's just like, how many of us have had experience with the deep sea or the ocean? Very few of us have any actual awareness of it. It's just not an issue for most people. And so this is a tremendous opportunity for imagination and persuasion, right? One being the data angle, right? As we gain more understanding and more quantification of the ocean environment and understanding of that, then because there's really very few political stakes in that, the ability just to sort of, let the machines manage it for the benefit of something other than human economic development is inspirational to me. Is that going to happen? I doubt it, right? The more we know about it, the more we're going to understand the resources, the more we're going to flood in there to try to exploit it. So, I would say that the idea of the deep sea, many ways like the idea of, Mars and lunar colonization and stuff, is a potent one because it is so unknown, right? So there's room to use that either metaphorically or literally to explore some of these other issues around crisis of the commons for land-based resources and whatnot. I mean, that's the supreme waffling answer of the evening, but you know.
Sort of tabletop kind of equivalent to the sort of sand modelling
around the ocean
approach that you've.
There's a guy named Nick Price who's based in London who does some work on the Arctic around snares. The Arctic is worth exploring. But the deep sea stuff is fascinating. I mean, you get into Peter Thiel and seasteading and all that sort of stuff, and Cesar Hidalgo, who's got all these sort of seafaring community stuff. And I mean, you get into really awesome, bizarre libertarian fantasies really quickly there. But yeah.
Right, just super quickly, just in terms of bringing a large amount of people that might be geographically spread and getting their views and getting them to discuss stuff with each other. There's lots of kind of shoestring visionaries that are building digital democratic platforms and basically trying to hack democracy in new ways. I mean, I think there's people in the room you should talk about that are also looking at this kind of stuff. Everything from like direct voting through to like liquid democratic things where your votes flow around. Blockchain is being used to create like kind of deliberative kind of like platforms. So the tools are there. The tools are definitely there, and they're changing all the time. I think the issue, and it's the issue which cuts across all of these digital democratic applications, is actually getting people interested enough in the topic to actually get involved. Yeah. You've either got Twitter, which is, or Facebook, where people are just banging off comments and everyone uses them, but actually they're not very good for kind of deliberative, kind of continuous discussion, actually reaching something which looks like a consensus. Or you've got these tools which are, and they're built for that, but they are onerous and slow and difficult, and consensus, as going back to what we're talking about, participation is across a large group of different kinds of people really difficult to get, and so therefore people don't really use them. But if but the tools are there, and the trick now, and maybe it's another design question, is how do you actually make the user experience such that people actually will be, and the end point such that people will actually begin to take time out of their busy days to actually start talking about things like that.
Let me end on a question just so we can queue up our next conversation. What's the difference between consensus and persuasion? Don't answer. Let's have another conversation later, because it's fascinating hearing you say this stuff, because there's so many. It's awesome. There's so many open questions around that.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you, Noah, Carl, and also for these great questions and for staying here this evening. Thank you very much, and hopefully we will continue the conversation in a design school as well, not just in your policy world. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for coming, everyone.